Hello, I'm David Card. Welcome to the Seamus Library, where the Irish Literary Society is gathered, and I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Hughes, from County Armagh originally, the author of two novels, The Countenance Divine and Country, which won last year's London Hellenic Prize. As the actor Michael Colgan, you may have seen him in the teledrama Chernobyl recently. Next to him is Lucy Caldwell, a Northern Irish playwright and novelist. Her latest collection of short stories, Multitudes, is published by Faber. She's also the editor of a marvellous anthology of current Irish writing called Being Various. And on my left is Jonathan Gibbs. He's a writer and critic, and the author of two novels, Randall or the Painted Grape and The Large Door. He also curates an online thing called a personal anthology, in which writers and critics select and rave about their favourite short stories. He's also, though reluctant to admit it, an acclaimed poet. He is now. And more on that story later. We're here to talk about Louis MacNeice, his legacy, his reputation, his influence, both as an Irish poet and as a 1930s poet. And in that respect, we'll be focusing on Autumn Journal. I think you'll agree it's an undisputed masterpiece and the thing for which he will be most remembered. An epic poem in 24 cantos about the anxieties and uncertainties of the months leading up to the Second World War, and the inspiration for Spring Journal by Jonathan Gibbs, an epic poem in 24 cantos about the uncertainties and anxieties that characterise the current crisis. And I was invited to say a few words about MacNeice, so with your permission. He was born in Belfast in 1907. Grew up in Carrickfergus, where his father was a Protestant minister, later a bishop. His mother, a school teacher, died when MacNeice was just 6 years old, and he was packed off to boarding school in England at the age of 10, first to Sherborne, a prep school, and then to Marlborough Public School, and then to Oxford, where he met Auden. They became good friends and would collaborate on one of the highlights of 1930s publishing, I think, Letters from Iceland, a magnificently eccentric travel book. It's during this period, I suppose, that he was later accused of de-Irishing himself. More of that later, perhaps. Auden and MacNeice together made up half of the pantomime horse called McSpawnday, the term invented by the right-wing South African poet Roy Campbell, glibly to dismiss what was never a movement.
It was a group of fairly well-known and quite glamorous young poets from Oxford: McSpawnday, MacNeice, Stephen Spender, W.H. Auden, and C. Day Lewis. I think it's fair to say that neither Day Lewis nor Spender attract much critical attention these days. Auden remains monumentally Auden, and MacNeice's stock has both fallen and risen over the last 40 years or so, and that'll be something we can also discuss, I hope. I think it was Tom Paulin who said that for the English reader, MacNeice appears to be Irish, while for certain Irish readers he doesn't really belong to Ireland. And that again, I think, is an intriguing aspect of his posthumous reputation and dare I say, rehabilitation as an Irish writer. His first collection, Blind Fireworks, was published in 1929 to little acclaim, and he considered it juvenilia and suppressed it thereafter. Poems appeared in 1935, the collaboration I mentioned with Auden the following year. He spent much of the next 3 decades working as a lecturer at the University of Birmingham and for the BBC, of which he said in Autumn Sequel, the poem he wrote 15 years after Autumn Journal, "Content to find there was ephemeral work to do, ephemeral work I did." Nevertheless, 15 poetry collections followed and numerous selected and collected. But Autumn Journal, which was written in 6 months, in 1938, is the highlight, navigating, as I say, the uncertainties of the period, the rise of fascism, the Spanish Civil War, political unrest in Britain, and his own turbulent private life, the ending of his first marriage and a subsequent love affair with Nancy Coldstream, wasn't it? Autumn Journal aside, there are many shorter poems that I'm sure we all have our favourites and may even have time to touch on. He had a, I think, consistent and distinctive voice as a poet, but even during his lifetime was regularly demoted by critics. Smart, irreverent, quick and cultivated, said Alvarez, a serious, sensitive individual, minor poet, and was often described disparagingly, I think, as an Oxford poet, as if he hadn't really travelled well, Auden, of course, being the benchmark for internationalism in those days. He enjoyed the male sodality of poets in pubs and bars and was quite a serious drinker, a two-fisted drinker, someone said, a pint in one hand and a whiskey in the other. 8 books were published posthumously, including a fine autobiography we were chatting about, The Strings of False. But 10 years after his death, his reputation had really entered the doldrums and would later be revived with a significant anthology, which I hope we'll discuss. I have nothing much more to say about him now, but can I pass over to Lucy and ask, what's your take on MacNeice as a poet and as an Irish poet?
MacNeice, he's one of the poets who's been most important to me. The closest thing I have to a creed of faith are his lines. The world is crazier and more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural. I peel and portion a tangerine and spit the pips and feel the drunkenness of things being various. And you've touched on some of the reasons that people haven't quite known how to read MacNeice, perhaps, to English for the Irish, to Irish for the English. I think he is such a massive contradictions that he transcends. His poetry, there's a lovely line in one of his letters to Eleanor Clark I've got here, his lover in 1939, he says, "There is always hope for those who are half damned. The really sunk are the people who think they are saved." And Louis MacNeice, he's wonderful. He's sceptical, fatalistic, optimistic. He's both completely sincere and completely ironic. He's a chancer, he's a charmer. His poetry is restless and questing and always alive. And for me, he takes all of the contradictions and in himself, he celebrates them. Autumn Journal is, you read it and you feel it on your lips, you feel it in your heart. There's a mischievous pleasure to it, there's a great sensual pleasure to it as well. MacNeice had a lot of love affairs. He was quite probably a functional alcoholic, had a troubled relationship with alcohol. He lives in extremes. And Autumn Journal, which we're going to discuss, it's very much a young person's poem.
He was 31. It's easy to forget this, I think. That he's always seemed to be an older man.
Yes, and you look at the picture of him, with the sort of hair, the hair and the nose, and when he writes Autumn Journal, he's 31, 32, and he's just moved into a flat overlooking Primrose Hill with his 4-year-old son from his first marriage. It's broken down. His wife Mary has left him. He's got his 4-year-old son. He's got a Hungarian nanny. She's a Jew. She's come from Hungary and she's his nanny. He's got a dog. He's going on walks in Primrose Hill. He's teaching at Bedford College for young ladies, which he describes as, hall of 1,000 virgins. He's attempting to. He's young, and he's insincere, and he's sincere, and he's attempting to make sense of the world around him. He calls himself a journalist poet.
And Autumn Journal is an act of almost documentary. I can't help comparing it to Auden's activities in the GPO film unit at more or less the same time, an attempt to get some reportage down to record urgently the events that are happening around him externally and internally. He would die at the age of 55 in 1963, but it is a good point that it's easy to forget this is a young man's poem, I think, because there's a maturity of judgment and wisdom. There's a certain kind of world-weary Philip Marlowe sense to the young MacNeice. You're going to read the first canto for us of Autumn Journal.
Which is written, Stallworthy, his biographer thinks, probably in August of 1938. He's been to visit his father, the bishop, by now a bishop, and his father's wife, who live in Hampshire, between Portsmouth and Southampton, and probably that's where he started writing the poem. because subsequently he writes to Eliot that he has this idea for this poem, and it's going to be, I have his letter here, I have an extract from it. He says, it's going to be a long, not strictly a journal, but giving the tenor of my intellectual and emotional experiences during that period. It's about nearly everything from which first-hand experience I consider significant. In the note to it, he says, in a journal or a personal letter, he says, a man writes what he feels at that moment. And so he invents this sort of elastic, he calls it an elastic quatrain, that can encompass everything, the personal and the political. Close and slow, summer is ending in Hampshire, ebbing away down ramps of shaven lawn, where close-clipped yew insulates the lives of retired generals and admirals, and the spyglasses hung in the hall, and the prayer books ready in the pew. And August going out to the tin trumpets of nasturtiums, and the sunflower's Salvation Army blare of brass, and the spinster sitting in a deck chair picking up stitches, not raising her eyes to the noise of the plains that pass northward from Lee on Solent. Macrocarpa and cypress, and roses on a rustic trellis, and mulberry trees, and bacon and eggs in a silver dish for breakfast, and all the inherited assets of bodily ease, and all the inherited worries, rheumatism and taxes, and whether Stella will marry, and what to do with Dick, and the branch of the family that lost their money in Hattree, and the passing of the Morning Post, and of life's climacteric, and the growth of vulgarity, cars that pass the gate lodge, and the crowds undressing on the beach, and the hiking cockney lovers with thoughts directed neither to God nor nation, but each to each. But the home is still a sanctum under the pelmets, all quiet on the family front. Farmyard noises across the fields at evening, while the trucks of the Southern Railway dawdle, shunt into poppy sidings for the night. Night which knows no passion, no assault of hands or tongue, for all is old as flint or chalk or pine needles, and the rebels and the young have taken the train to town, or the two-seater, unravelling rails or road, losing the thread deliberately behind them, autumnal palinode. And I am in the train now too, and summer is going south as I go north, bound for the dead leaves falling, the burning bonfire, the dying that brings forth the harder life, revealing the trees' girders, the frost that kills the germs of laissez-faire. Westmeon, Tisted, Farnham, Woking, Weybridge, then London's packed and stale and pregnant air. My dog, a symbol of the abandoned order, lies on the carriage floor, her eyes inept and glamorous as a film star's, who wants to live, i.e. wants more presents, jewellery, furs, gadgets, solicitations, as if to live were not following the curve of a planet or controlled water, but a leap in the dark, a tangent, a stray shot. It is this we learn after so many failures, the building of castles in sand, of queens in snow, that we cannot make any corner of life or in life's beauty, that no river is a river which does not flow. Surbiton, and a woman gets in, painted with dyed hair, but a ladder in her stocking, and eyes patient beneath the calculated lashes, inured forever to surprise, and the train's rhythm becomes the ad nauseam repetition of every tired Obad and maudlin madrigal, the faded airs of sexual attraction wandering like dead leaves along a warehouse wall. I loved my love with a platform ticket, a jazz song, a handbag, a pair of stockings of Paris sand. I loved her long. I loved her between the lines and against the clock, not until death, but till life did us part. I loved her with paper money and with whiskey on the breath. I loved her with peacock's eyes and the wares of Carthage, with glass and gloves and gold and a powder puff, with blasphemy, camaraderie and bravado, and lots of other stuff. I loved my love with the wings of angels dipped in henna, unearthly red, with my office hours, with flowers and sirens, with my budget, my latchkey, and my daily bread. And so to London, and down the ever-moving stairs, where a warm wind blows the bodies of men together, and blows apart their complexes and cares.
Thank you, that was marvellous. He's a very good urban poet, isn't he? MacNeice, amongst other things, and that's such a 30s poem. The concerns of it, the jazz pastiche and the platform tickets and so on.
He's a poet of things and stuff. It always reminds me of Frank O'Hara in that way, you know, poet writing a little later, but the things that he puts into his poem, you know, all the stuff of everyday life, all the particularities.
Yeah, and very observant, as one expects our poets to be. The woman getting on the train in particular clearly registers very, very, very accurately and visibly. What else do you find to admire in that canto? And is it a typical canto for the rest of the journal?
I think what Autumn Journal does so successfully is seeing the political through the intensely personal. You know, that's what he set out to do. And in Jonathan's, in Spring Journal, Jonathan's brilliant companion piece, it's also a friend of William MacNeice's, I believe when he was still at Oxford, said there's no curtain between him and the world, which is a lovely way of looking at it. And so his experiences are at once deeply personal and deeply particular, the things that he's observing, but he has, when Henry James talks about how a writer needs to have a radar, they need to be absorbing everything in the world, they need to be an antenna, you know, be a lightning rod. MacNeice has that. He's taking in absolutely everything, and he's conscious of himself moving through the place, and he's conscious of himself moving through the time, and he's very good at the other thing that canto does, which I think is typical of the whole poem, although at times it becomes more strongly one thing than another. It's shuttling back and forth between the personal, between the political, between the past, between the present, between Spain, between here, between now. He's very good at that sense of time and place accordioning.
In his own phrase, he called the poem a panorama and a confession of faith. Yeah. And it certainly has that broad synoptic sweep and that intensely personal core and focus, which brings us to Jonathan's Spring Journal, which you've just mentioned. Can you tell us, first of all, how the idea of Spring Journal came to you, as I think it did in a kind of flash one evening?
So this was in March. It was March the 18th, 2020. And I just got back from my university job, and it was the last day I was going to be in my office. And I was lounging around on the sofa, and I had my phone out, and I was on Twitter. And I love thinking of ways to justify being on Twitter as being creative. And I suddenly thought about Autumn Journal, and I thought, wow, MacNeice would have loved this moment. He would have responded to it amazingly. I thought, oh, well, he's not here. I could do it. And so I created a new Twitter account, Spring Journal. No one had taken it. If someone had taken that Twitter handle for some other reason, it wouldn't exist. That elastic quatrain, 4 lines, fits in a tweet. And so I think I did 2 tweets that night, and I had no followers. And then the next day I got up and did a few more, and it started out purely as pastiche. I was just taking the lines, you know, close and slow, and I was adapting them to what was going on with coronavirus in London in March. And obviously it was very nice that, this develops through the poem in the end, but we reflect each other. He's writing about autumn going into winter. I was writing about spring going into summer. And the reason, I suppose, that the idea came to me was because I knew Autumn Journal and loved it and had absorbed some of what it was trying to do. And in fact, I had taught it to undergraduate students as a way of writing. And partly with undergraduate students, you have to get them to be something other than personal, because a lot of them use poetry just to express personal hopes and fears and anxieties. And I say, look, you can mix that up with stuff that's going on out there. And I would use a canto from Autumn Journal to demonstrate that. And so that was really where it came from. And I carried on doing it because I was enjoying it, and a few people followed it on Twitter and said that they enjoyed it, and that gave me the sort of confidence to keep going. And I wrote, I suppose, the equivalent of, I sort of went through the first 2 cantos, I suppose, and that was the point, David, at which you had been reading it and said that you liked it, and you were organising a series, had already started organising a series of, I suppose I call them online literary salons for lockdown, called A Leap in the Dark, which would meet on Friday and Saturday nights.
That makes them sound terribly respectable. But yes, gatherings, should we say, gatherings of...
And would I be interested in having Spring Journal feature in that? And we talked about it, and you mentioned that Michael would be would be happy to read it. And so what then it formalised itself into the idea that I would then produce a canto a week. And it suddenly became very serious, and I suddenly realised I didn't have my copy of Autumn Journal because it was stuck in my university office and I couldn't get it anymore. And I then, I mean, it was such a delight to give myself the task of looking at this poem really, really closely and reading it over and over and over again, and then going on Twitter. Would MacNeice, and this is something that people say, would so-and-so have been good on Twitter? I think MacNeice
Definitely,
would probably have been
yeah,
good
he
on
would
Twitter,
be
wouldn't he?
I think so. It has a kind of jittery, contingent
Yeah.
feel. It's
Yeah.
it's like sharing rough drafts.
Yeah, absolutely.
world.
So
Yes, and MacNeice, he says in a letter to Eliot that he didn't revise it. He could have revised it, but he kept it. It was very much written as he was living it.
yeah,
And that's one of the brilliant things about Spring
Yeah.
Journal, is looking back now, even from not very many months ago, that lockdown period feels such a blur. And yet, because at each of your cantos you have the date that they're written, there are details like the Llandudno goats,
yeah,
which I remember seeing in Llandudno. There were goats who'd taken over the town,
yeah.
and all these particular things that are so much of that moment, so unique to that moment.
It's interesting now you're talking of the poem as a whole retrospectively, but for those of us lucky enough to hear Michael's Friday readings every week for 24 weeks,
Yeah.
Something which made the whole lockdown period in a strange way navigable for many of us in the audience. I'd often find myself thinking, what will Jonathan do with this particular odd moment during the clusterfuck of government mismanagement and all these epic-making things like the Colston statue toppled into Bristol docks and the goats in Llandudno and so on. So it made a very weird atemporal period, somehow structured for all of us, and to receive each week the latest canto in its entirety was both a pleasure and a rather daunting moment. And then to hear Michael read, as he's going to in a moment, I think, the latest canto, and to be part of an audience within the timeline of the poem. That's a unique experience, I think, and unlikely to be repeated, because we didn't know how it would end. You had no idea where it would take us, what public and private events were in the future. So it was an extraordinary achievement, I think, to deliver week after week after week after week for 24 weeks, perfectly formed, lengthy cantos.
Yeah.
And you took possession of it beautifully, I think. There was obviously a debt to MacNeice, but a debt honourably paid, I think.
Yeah, I think, well, that's very kind of you to say, but I could, this is my poem is a companion piece, is a lovely way of saying it, but it is dependent entirely. And I suppose the success of my poem, was that I found fellow feeling in that voice. And so when you said, he was a mess of contradictions, but he'd found a form that allowed him to go anywhere within that. And the fact that there was a mess of contradictions meant that I could do anything. Because I hope I'm not the same mess of contradictions as him, but whatever I wanted to do, I could find something in what he was doing.
The lovely moments in Spring Journal when you're in conversation with him. He's writing about his love affair with Nancy Coldstream, and you're writing, Louis, I can't write like this because I'm writing from the position of a marriage of 20 years.
Yeah.
But I'm going to try, and the ways that you pull away from him and argue with him and diverge and do your own thing is lovely as well. And the very ending of both, where you hand back to him, is really moving.
Yeah.
You overcame the poetic disadvantage of having a long and happy marriage.
Yes. But it was I'd forgotten how young he was. And the reason I've forgotten is that he is a masterful poet. So I'm 40. I had my 48th birthday during the poem, and he wrote this when he was 31, 32. But to me, he's the teacher.
He's literally young enough, I suppose, to be your son.
Oh, it's ludicrous.
But seems to be the daddy to us all.
Yes,
I'll never be grown up and mature in the way Louis MacNeice is, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Or come to that Philip Marlowe. There's a kind of masculine maturity there that evades most of us, I think, most of the time. Can I invite Michael now, the voice of Spring Journal for 6 months, to read for us, as he did for us back in April, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The first canto to a rapt audience in a Zoom room. These were online gatherings, I should point out. And over to you, Michael.
Close and slow, Spring is starting in London, creeping up through the thick-set lawns that, though too wet to cut, still taunt the retired accountants and asset managers who would have been out there by now for certain, but strange thoughts stay their hands from the barber in the hallway and the lead and poop bags by the door. For this spring brings headlines from Italy and China, and nobody knows what they're allowed to do anymore. And it's March coming in as the last daffs are fading and the first nasturtiums coming, ignorant of the farce. And the mother popping out to Tesco despite her daughter's warnings, raising her eyes to the few remaining planes that pass westwards from Heathrow, which is no longer owed an extra runway. For so it is we learn to live in air that's good to breathe. And the canals in Venice running clear with little fishes swimming, and the tourists at the airport asking when they'll get to leave. And it's Friday night in London where the pubs are all still open. For the blessed who think it's fine to drink, then loll home in an Uber. Do they raise a glass to those still stuck on board the MS Braemar, turned away from every port till they were taken in by Cuba? And all the inherited worries, the social anxieties and taxes, and whether Stella will marry, and what to do with Dick, and the great uncle who lost his savings to a fraudster, and is this tightness in the chest merely asthmatic? And the growth of vulgarity, electric scooters on the pavement, and the rising tide of plastic on the beach, and the hiking LGBTQ plus lovers with thoughts directed neither to God nor sovereign nation, but each to each. And the queue for Sainsbury's this morning was impressive. The hundreds of shoppers with their trolleys at 10 to 7 on a weekend is just the highest tide mark of our ongoing infinite follies. So I'm tweeting this from the till queue trailing up aisle 27. There's plenty of shampoo and hairspray, and there's eggs and bread and bleach and chips and lasagna, but even those might be gone by now, I dare say. And the question of privilege raises its head, as of course it does in every aspect of the current situation, and what each one of us does and can possibly do is permanently affected. The tins I'll decant into the food bank by the exit are, let's face it, scant atonement for my middle-class security. And the GoFundMe donations for artists and writers faced with shock redundancy. So let's hear it for Picture House Cinemas sacking staff as a matter of course. And let's hear it for the Coilenbridge Hotel in Aviemore, which apologised for any upset caused after laying off a dozen workers in what they called an administrative error. God knows what goes through these people's heads as they write these letters, if they understand the terror. The terror. Is it terror? This fluctuating fear, anxiety and worry all laid one over the other like card laid over card. And everyone I speak to seems broadly fine, but there are others online that this crisis is hitting more squarely and hard. And I'm in the car now, and the sun is out as we are heading east, bound for the Essex coast, and the shock of wave on shingle, the visit to my wife's parents to deliver essential items and offer solace, but not to hug or kiss or even mingle. And so we sit in our parked cars and eat fish and chips from cardboard boxes, watching the too many people on the esplanade and the not enough sky. For we cannot eat in the flat, and the communal room is closed, and this is the English way. And the drive back, yawning, with the sun low in the windscreen, though it's now that it gives its most singular light, painting the winter wheat a rich green gold and dotting the turned brown clay with canaletto white. And as I stand pissing against the hedge, I notice the first hawthorn blossoms, simple specks in a complex pattern, like you might find printed on wallpaper or on a cushion or curtain. And so back to London, its own uncertainties evolving, the density of population, the space and air we share, where the warm spring wind blows us dangerously together and infects our complexes and cares.
Thank you, Michael. I get the thrill again after 6 months or more, the way that Spring Journal enriches and is in turn enriched by Autumn Journal, and how both retain that perennial question, what shall we do with Dick? Some lines are best left alone, I guess, to stand. Can you talk us perhaps a little through the actual process here. Did you have a copy of Autumn Journal to hand and a blank sheet of paper, and initially, I guess, going line by line through it and thinking, can I use that? Can I adapt it? Can I adopt it?
I mean, I tried as far as possible, because it originated as a Twitter experiment. So I tried as far as possible to write it on Twitter, no pen and paper, just a copy of the MacNeice and my phone, and trying to put together 4 lines at a time, and then follow thread or whatever it is, read this thread or expand this thread, and so I'd add the tweet to the last tweet and allow it to go on and on and on. But I was obviously reading ahead and looking and thinking, what can I use and what can't I use? And I wasn't thinking about it as a poem. I was thinking about what can I use and what do I need to say that's not in it. So the sort of question of which bits would be adapted and which bits would be slavishly copied and which bits would be junked, and I had something else that I needed to say. Really, from the word go, it was a mix of all those things. The Louis MacNeice estate had been very supportive, but at the time I didn't give them a thought, and so that first canto, I suppose, has got bits mixed in that are mine and bits that are his and bits that are responding to what's going on outside. And in I remember looking through the rest of the cantos and finding ones where I was thinking, I'll have nothing. Once I realised that this challenge had been set, there were bits where I was looking at a canto and go, well, there's nothing I can do here. I can't. He's right. He's spending 120 lines talking about Irishness. That's got nothing for me. What can I do with that? And there are other bits that I knew, the Canto 15. Shelley and Jazz and Leader and Love and Hymn Tunes, ones that I knew very well. I thought, well, that'll fit perfectly. I'll be able to use that. That'll be great. I look forward to that. And that was the challenge, but also the freedom that he gave, I felt, was that if there's something here that applies and is appropriate, and I'm not the only person to have found Autumn Journal to be a really relevant text during this last year. Samuel West, the actor, has been reading out cantos from it on SoundCloud. And I felt that there was a permission saying there's going to be stuff here which is relevant, but I felt that there was freedom to not to use the stuff that wasn't relevant.
I think it's fair to say what began perhaps in a light-hearted moment as a pastiche soon became an homage and then became something else of a different order. It became real poetry, although I think we're reluctant to admit this. And I found myself early on reading each fresh canto and then going back to Autumn Journal to see just what you had done. But within a couple of weeks I was reading Autumn Journal ahead of the next canto and asking myself, what's he going to do with this? What could be carried forward? What are the challenges here? It became part of the intense and very rich pleasure of having these 2 books on the go over a period of 6 months in real time, as it were.
I mean, I know a lot of creative people. Lucy, you were talking earlier about having done some really good work during lockdown on a novel, and I thought, come February, this is great. I'll be able to really crack on with my next novel. Didn't happen at all. I was reading MacNeice in bed at night, and then I was getting in the end. Some of it was written on Twitter and some of it was written at the computer. But I was getting up early and trying to spend, often spending half an hour or an hour a day in the morning working on that week's canto. Michael, did you get stuff done in lockdown?
I read this. Which was I wanted to ask you, Jonathan, or Lucy, about how MacNeice wrote. Did he write Autumn Journal in a continuous process, showing it to people? Do you know, or was he saving it up for a book? Did we know what he was up to?
There's a lovely letter. There's a letter where he writes to Eliot on, I think, the 5th of December, and he's promised him his poem by December, and he just says, "Dear Eliot, thanks for your letter. Sorry, it's not going to be ready." At this point, it's already gone into Faber's spring catalogue, and he says, "But I'm sorry, I will. I'll get it to you."
So he was already sort of the poet with a profile, and it was being written. I don't know anything. I'm acquainted with the poem as a result of this, but I don't know anything about its conception.
He'd had one book out with Faber, I think, by that time. The poems.
I mean, was it a commission as such? Was he?
No, I mean, he pitched it, didn't he?
He pitched it. And one of the things I love about MacNeice is that he's a jobbing writer, and he takes any commission going. He's sort of always on the make, borrowing money off students, telling friends they owe him a debt. He's got a son, he's got a flat, and he's writing. He collaborated with Nancy Coldstream on a book called Zoo, London Zoo, and she drew some pictures, and his letter to Iceland, his trips to the Outer Hebrides, his his poetry. And I think that's one of the reasons that his star did decline, because in amongst, he's very prolific, partly because he needs to be, he needs to make a living, he's living by his pen. And so in amongst some of the, magisterial work, there's some that's not quite so. There's some that's written because he needs the commission, he needs money. But this book, it was written, it's got a sort of real roving generosity to it, a sense of being written on the hoof, that I think lends itself, it allows you to make it your own.
Yeah.
Was there a moment that you felt it take off? I think we can feel it even from that first canto.
Yeah.
It lifts.
Yeah.
Pastiche.
Yeah. I mean, there were. I suppose what in the end, as David sort of said, it started out as a sort of jeu d'esprit. Then it became an homage. I think I spent a long time trying to understand what he was doing as a poet. That elastic quatrain and the way he uses his rhymes, he is so confident in that. And I thought I'd got it at the beginning. And as I went through, I realised I hadn't got it at all. And I had to do a lot more homework. And I think it improved me as a writer incredibly. It's like that thing about people saying, I typed out Joan Didion saying she's typing out Hemingway stories and stuff like that. This is the closest I've ever got to that. But I think there was a point where I realised that if this was going to be serious, I'd have to be as soul-searching in it as he was. And so when it came to stuff like Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and such like, I just had to think, okay, what would Louis do? Louis would be honest and he would look inside. And so that was really where I felt that I had him looking at me going, say, okay then, write about racism, write about white privilege, because I sure as hell wouldn't have dodged the bullet. When it came to that.
This was another thrill, seeing you, as it were, come into possession of Spring Journal, and it became wholly meant.
Yeah.
It wasn't enthralled to MacNeice.
Yeah.
It respected MacNeice and
Yeah.
was prompted in many cases by the concerns of each
Yeah.
canto, but it was your life, your work, our time.
Canto 4. September has come. It is hers, whose vitality leaps in the autumn, whose nature prefers trees without leaves and a fire in the fireplace. So I give her this month and the next, though the whole of my year should be hers, who has rendered already so many of its days intolerable or perplexed, but so many more so happy, who has left a scent on my life and left my walls dancing over and over with her shadow, whose hair is twined in all my waterfalls and all of London littered with remembered kisses. So I am glad that life contains her with her moods and moments, more shifting and more transient than I had yet thought of as being integral to beauty, whose mind is like the wind on a sea of wheat, whose eyes are candour, and assurance in her feet, like a homing pigeon never by doubt diverted, to whom I send my thanks that the air has become shot silk, the streets are music, and that the ranks of men are ranks of men, no more of ciphers. So that, if now, alone, I must pursue this life, it will not be only a drag from numbered stone to numbered stone, but a ladder of angels, river turning tidal.
And yes, all right, Louis, April has come. It is hers, whose blood lifts a notch in the springtime, but whose nature prefers the more rigorous glories of summer, the pure straight hit of sun and heat, not for the leaves stunned to life on the branches, but for the joy of sandals on feet and sunglasses tangled in hair. And so I give her this month and the next, though they are likely to be ours regardless as we face the new and strange context. She with even temper and hopes and projects, even. So I am glad that my life is circumscribed by hers, with her ambitions reaching farther than any I can claim I've had. And perhaps it was easier for MacNeice to make Canto 4 of Autumn Journal a love poem, for his subject was not there to police his words, and you are. So here goes. Frivolous when you feel like it, early for every flight, frowning only at your own thoughts, taking particular notice of trainers and handbags, for your work wardrobe is tightly constrained. A carousel of cardigans, rich in competence and style, rarely untidy if we overlook the loading of the dishwasher. Wearing your first grey hairs like a newly awarded degree, on occasion too easily hurt, though never arrogant. With your love that can need provoking, which is itself provoking. For long-term love is a form of knowledge that comes mixed with not knowing. And how those elements are arrayed is not fixed and is itself unknowable, which is part of the pleasure.
Canto 15. Shelley and jazz and leader and love and hymn tunes, and day returns too soon. We'll get drunk among the roses in the valley of the moon. Give me an aphrodisiac, give me lotus, give me the same again. Make all the erotic poets of Rome and Ionia and Florence and Provence and Spain pay a tithe of their sugar to my potion and ferment my days with the twang of Hawaii and the boom of the Congo. Let the old muse loosen her stays, or give me a new muse with stockings and suspenders and a smile like a cat, with false eyelashes and fingernails of carmine, and dressed by Schiaparelli with a pillbox hat. Let the aces run riot round Brooklands, let the tape machines go drunk, turn on the purple spotlight, pull out the Vox Humana, dig up somebody's body in a cloakroom trunk. Give us sensations, and then again sensations. Striptease, fireworks, all-in wrestling, gin. Spend your capital, open your house and pawn your padlocks. Let the critical sense go out and the roaring boys come in. Give me a houri, but houris are too easy. Give me a nun. We'll rape the angels off the golden redodos before we're done. Tiger woman and Lesbos, drums and entrails, and let the skies rotate. We'll play roulette with the stars. We'll sit out drinking at the hangman's gate. Oh, look who comes here. I cannot see their faces, walking in file, slowly in file. They have no shoes on their feet. The knobs of their ankles catch the moonlight as they pass the stile and cross the moor among the skeletons of bog oak, following the track from the gallows back to the town. Each has the end of a rope around his neck. I wonder who let these men come back, who cut them down. And now they reach the gate and line up opposite the neon lights on the medieval wall, and underneath the sky signs, each one takes his cowl and lets it fall, and we see their faces, each the same as the other, men and women, each like a closed door. But something about their faces is familiar. Where have we seen them before?
Stormzy and dubstep and TikTok and Tinder, and day returns too soon. We'll get plastered at the free bar in the revamped catacombs. Give me an aphrodisiac, give me a swipe right, give me the same again. Make all the erotic poets of Shoreditch and Streatham and Peckham and Brixton and Penge lend their honeyed bars to my wicked purpose. And let us give the DJ thanks for the warp of the bass and the strobe of the sequins. Let the old muse get out of her Spanx. Or give me a new muse in something from La Perla, hair waving like a flag, with mascara as black as the cosmos, fingernails of crimson, dressed by Valentino with a Chanel clutch bag. Let the gamers run riot round Fortnite Island, let the graphic cards all glitch. Flip your gender in FaceApp and see if you fancy yourself as a himbo or bitch. Give us distractions, and then again, distractions, deep fakes, fireworks, vagina candles, bling. Spend your Bitcoin, share your PayPal and your password. Let the critical thinking go out and the Twitter pylons begin. Give me a fuckboy, but fuckboys are too easy. Give me a saint. We'll feed him to the trolls, smear him across the meme pool. We won't countenance complaint. Bring on the Insta girls and the influencers. Let them bow to our conceit. Bring on the stands and the also rans. The end of all this shit will be so sweet. But look who comes here. I cannot see their faces, walking slowly, slowly, one by one. They're coming from the hospitals and care homes. Their faces are pale in the late June sun, or see-through even. I wonder where they're going. Could it be to the golf club, or the model village, bingo hall or theme park? Or just to the pub. Each has an oxygen mask around their neck. I wonder who let them all come back. Who signed their discharge papers, snipped off their wristbands? Is someone somewhere keeping track? and they're 4 deep at the bar and knocking at my elbow, when there should surely be no trace of any of them anywhere. They should be gone or invisible. There is something familiar about this one's face, and this one also. Where have I seen them before? They're crowding the public houses, and those that can't get in are banging at the door.
So we've heard several cantos from Autumn Journal and Spring Journal. I think you get a good idea of the way they communicate with each other, enrich each other. I'm reminded of the very last canto, Canto 24, and its reading in August on this so-called salon, in which Michael was joined by 10 other readers, musicians, performers, and others, to read all 24 cantos until the culmination of the final canto, which is a night I don't think anyone will easily forget. And we all felt a gap in our lives after that. How will we navigate the rest of the crisis? How will we find our way through this? Happily, and it was announced earlier this week, Jonathan, Spring Journal will be published, and very soon.
Yes, so Charles Boyle, who runs the brilliant CB editions, is going to publish it, and he is going to publish it before Christmas, and that's just the way he works. I think he loves the idea that as an independent press he can move quicker than the sometimes oil tanker style publishers elsewhere.
A speedboat in a world of cumbersome liners.
And so so it's and the MacNeice estate are very supportive, so thank you to them.
Well, that's good. And your publisher says of it, I'm going to embarrass you
okay.
here. Spring Journal is an honest, angry, sad, thoughtful, appalled, urgent act of witness to this lousy year. Why would anyone want to be reminded? Well, it's a good question. The poem, he says, is deeply sceptical of exaggerated or romantic notions of what poetry can do and what it's for. It feels, nevertheless, in part because of this scepticism, a necessary work, which it certainly is. So we look forward to the chance to revisit Spring Journal in the comfort of our own home.
Yes, thank you.
In the weeks and months and years ahead of us. So, if I may, I brought this along, this handsome volume, the Faber Book of Irish Verse from 1973, edited by John Montague, which I think serves to show how low MacNeice's stock had fallen in the 10 years since his death. He gets just one canto, 3 pages, out of a very substantial volume of no fewer than 125 Irish writers. 5 of them are not men. It goes to show how far we've come since 1973. And it was, I think, 1986 when Michael Longley edited a fresh Faber book of contemporary Irish poetry, and which really gave prime position, pride of place, to MacNeice, and I think in a way rehabilitated him as an Irish poet. Is this a contentious area still? Is MacNeice an Anglo-Irish poet, an Irish poet?
MacNeice has come to be extremely important to a new generation of especially Northern Irish writers. We were having this conversation earlier, Michael and I, about the centenary of Northern Ireland coming up, about all those tricky questions of identity and what is Northern Irishness. And the way that I always see it is a celebration of the possibility of multiplicities, pure MacNeice. And I think a whole generation of poets at Queen's and clustered around the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's have come to see a sort of guiding light in MacNeice, someone who can make a virtue of contradictions, who can simultaneously be very sincere and deeply ironic, can be sceptical and optimistic, be all of these contrary things. And also MacNeice is someone who, he grew up, there's such a sense of yearning always in MacNeice, there's a sense of, he grew up, he talks about his father who came from Connemara. His father, Connemara to him, it was too rich a word to contain all that place had been. He has that sense of loss from childhood. Of course, his mother died, and then he was sent off to England, and his stepmother hoped that he and his sister would lose their Irish accents, which they duly did. And MacNeice at school, he fitted in by giving away his twice weekly sweet allowance, and by turning his feet out and walking like a clown and playing up to the idea of the Irish buffoon. And so MacNeice, and he feels a complicated pull, the place that he comes from, the facade that he's had to create to fit in, a facade concealing any kind of emotion, concealing this deep loss of his mother and the sense of her depression, in the sense that he was to blame because it was after the difficult birth of him that his mother got ill and never recovered. And so there's a lot going on, there's so much going on, and there's so much not knowing where he more truly comes from. And I think that's something that certainly I felt all of my life, all of my writing life, that there must be a place to which I more truly belong, that I'm not entirely Irish, that I'm not exactly British, that I'm Irish when I'm not in Ireland, which is something that MacNeice felt, that as soon as I go back, I didn't belong there enough, that I had never lived there as an adult, as MacNeice never did. And I think that for particularly writers of our sort of generation, we have found in MacNeice someone who manages to articulate all of that. I'm always surprised by the familiar, there's such a great familiarity, such a joy, such a surprise, but MacNeice, he articulates things that still feel very important.
This is great to hear. It's oddly enough, John Montagu said something like that in 1973, but in a disparaging way, if I can quote from his introduction, that MacNeice is very much a father figure for the poets of the province. And there's a view, maybe from the South, from the Republic, that was a sort of niche within Irish poetry. Is that a division that could be said to exist today?
I don't know. I think of the famous time when Longley and two others went to Carrador to visit MacNeice's grave, and Michael Longley is funny when he talks about it because he says that all three of them knew that the other was composing an elegy in their head at the same time, as they were conscious there were going to be these three competing elegies coming out, and MacNeice's is Longley's elegy to MacNeice is
you can imagine them racing back to their respective cars
exactly,
to get back to the hotel to start
and so I
work.
think Michael Longley, he really did rehabilitate MacNeice. MacNeice had that sort of classic dip in his poetic life that a lot of poets seem to have. He wrote Autumn Sequel, which has flashes of brilliance, but it doesn't come close to
Not a
Autumn
patch, is
Journal.
it? Sadly, I think he realises that in the very.
He realises
tone,
the horrible thing
yes.
is you can sort of feel as you're reading it that he knows it as well.
He also disparages, surprisingly, Autumn Journal as something he wrote in smoke, something ephemeral almost. But if anything could be said to last, I think Autumn Journal will be the MacNeice poem, along with a few other great favourites. So if anything is secure, his reputation is secure now.
I hope so. I mean, the other thing to say about Autumn Journal is that he wrote it in 1938, before the war had started, after the disaster of the Spanish War, and he manages to end it on an optimistic note. Or he decides to end it on an optimistic note, and he was right. You know, he ends by saying there will be sunlight again, and the occasion will come out. And for the Allies, Britain and Ireland, that did happen. And so we look at that now as a document and say he decided to be, or he found himself being prophetic, and he was right.
Yes, it's prophetic in a way that Autumn Sequel is merely nostalgic.
Yeah.
Autumn Sequel is very much backward looking.
Yeah.
We know, of course, what happens at the end of the low dishonest decade. We know what's coming.
Yeah.
And that informs a reading of Autumn Journal and adds to it, I think.
Yeah.
We don't know what's coming, as it were, after Spring Journal.
Yeah.
And we'll maybe look back on what I think is the phony plague of the summer of 2020 with a degree of nostalgia even for the relative freedoms and lack of restrictions that we had. But I think both works speak to our time and to their own time and to each other.
So congratulations, MacNeice. And congratulations, Jonathan Gibbs. Long may your partnership continue to prosper. Thank you very much. And thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Michael.
Sleep the past and wake the future and walk out promptly through the open door. But you, my coward doubts, may go on sleeping. You need not wake again, not anymore. The new year comes with bombs. It is too late to dose the dead with honourable intentions. If you have honour to spare, employ it on the living. The dead are dead as 1938. Sleep to the noise of running water, tomorrow to be crossed, however deep. This is no river of the dead or Lethe. Tonight we sleep on the banks of the Rubicon. The die is cast. There will be time to audit the accounts later. There will be sunshine later, and the equation will come out at last.